Good day. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to contribute to today's discussion. My presentation is on democratic governance and data, navigating the political economy. These views are mine alone and should not be attributed to my organization, not to ID Insight and not to Ateneo Policy Center. It is part of my work as a member of the UN Committee on Experts on Public Administration. It draws on a paper that I prepared for the recent meeting held in UN last April of this year. And many of the ideas I will talk to you today about are things that we also discussed in that meeting with colleagues in UN SEPA. It's a pleasure for me to join today's discussion on the topic of democratic governance. So without further ado, I will begin my presentation by showing you the outline. I will first begin with a discussion of the data and evidence and how it relates to democratic governance. And then I will go to a discussion of a basic theory of data access and how transparency can actually reduce the power asymmetry across democratic stakeholders, essentially those who have the public good in mind and those who have private goods in mind. Then I will go to a brief discussion of the reality of data use today. And this is part of the policy research that I've done and this paper that I have done that draws basically on a broad review of literature and practice in today's various democracies as it relates to the use of data and evidence base in policy making. Then I will talk about the challenges to data-informed and data-empowered democratic governance and what we need to do in order to better appreciate how to address the challenges. My very simple message is that we must look at the entire ecosystem of evidence-based policymaking in order to address which parts of the ecosystem are weak and how to address those weaknesses. And we cannot really just look at the different parts and not sort of link them into a broader whole, a broader ecosystem. And that's really what we need to focus on. Finally, I will discuss a number of policy recommendations as requested in order for us to respond to these challenges that I will elaborate on in this presentation. So here I begin with the basic theory, the basic narrative of why data and evidence base is very important in democratic governance. So here we begin with data and evidence can help inform better and more cost-effective policies and programs, in turn leading to improved public services and stronger development outcomes, which in turn merit strong political support. So in a nutshell, the simplified theory behind data and evidence-based policymaking is that in a democracy, if governments do not give good results, they lose sympathy and possibly votes. Therefore, its inefficiency has a high cost, and therefore the way to improve performance based on the use of knowledge or evidence is sought. Now, this is the basic theory, but as I will elaborate on later in the presentation, this is not necessarily what we are observing in reality. But before going to that, let me just go through one of the models which I based the paper on. This is the work of several World Bank economists that published recently on the importance of data transparency. And I believe this is reflective of the bigger support for open government, open data systems that empower democratic governance in various parts of the world. And perhaps the theory that underpins this broad open government movement is very simple, and we can look at this one model to enlighten us on how to look at that open government model. In this model, we have a large group of citizens, so democratic stakeholders. On the one hand, there's the broad group of citizens, and they are more difficult to organize, and typically they lobby for public goods. And then there is a smaller group of citizens which is better organized at lobbying for private goods that satisfy the group's interests only. So utility maximizing policymaker will have two groups of citizens that he or she needs to respond to. the large group that is not so well organized, and the small group that is better organized. And so you can imagine that in the absence of transparency, the small group may actually have a lot of power in this kind of a system. If you have opaqueness in policymaking, if the broad group of citizens, the large group, do not see that the smaller group actually gets a large share of the resources or is always prioritized by the policymaker, what you have is an asymmetry that may be sustained because the large group is not able to respond to the inequality in resource allocation. So the result is, according to this theory, that if you introduce greater transparency, you will have a reduction in the power asymmetry that the model suggests may actually exist. So here, if you introduce greater transparency, the large group may be able to appreciate better the inequality in resource allocation and would then be able to presumably organize itself better and move in order to put more pressure on the policymaker to correct some, if not all of that inequality in resource allocation. So this is how the basic model works, and it supports the argument that greater transparency is a good thing. This is something that we need to promote. This is, of course, the theory that has supported, in many ways, the data openness movement that we have seen, let's say, in public finance, in many other aspects of democratic governance. But it is not necessarily the end-all and be-all of democratic governance today. Certainly in recent years, when we have seen challenges to democratic governance brought about by populism. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about that aspect that I assume I do not have to elaborate on what populism is. This is the rise of the types of leaders, populist leaders, who are by definition quite popular, even though they are quite often divisive. They don't often listen to data and evidence, and they are often characterized as supporting the spread of disinformation and misinformation. So I'm going to give you a few examples just to show how big a threat this is to evidence-based policymaking. This is one example coming from an industrial country, and this is coming from the recent experience of the pandemic. We're essentially talking about their chief scientist to respond to that pandemic, but that expert has actually faced many challenges in trying to push for better, stronger evidence-based policymaking. So I'll just read the quote. Trump supporters chanted "Fire Fauci," and the president mused openly about doing so. He was accused of inventing the virus and of being part of a secret cabal with Bill Gates and George Soros to profit from vaccines. His family received death threats. And on January 21, appearing in his first press briefing under the Biden administration, Dr. Fauci described the liberating feeling of once again being able to get up here and talk about what you know, what the evidence and the science is. So this appears to be a challenge even for an industrial country that one would expect already has strong institutions to generate and promote data and evidence-based policymaking. But because of this populist wave that we are seeing in many democratic countries, you will see that evidence-based policymaking is not always that strong, that robust. Here's another example, this time not an industrial country, a developing country. And here the quote reads, "Those who are critical of Bolsonaro's policies," and Bolsonaro being their leader, "fear for their jobs and even their physical safety. Science is being attacked on several fronts." A veteran ecologist at the National Institute of Amazonian Research said, "There is denial of the pandemic, denial of climate change, denial of deforestation, not to mention budget cuts." So here we see also a clear example of how populism is pushing back against the scientific community, the community that is presumably in charge of the data and evidence-based policymaking ecosystem, to the extent that they generate that data and evidence base that informs and underpins that ecosystem. So clearly there are many challenges, and even before populism, here I just want to emphasize that there is an inequality, an imbalanced data and research availability, both across the world and across countries and even within countries. This is an interesting study of research in Africa. Professor Porteous studied over 27,000 economic research studies in 54 countries in that continent and found that 90% of the variation in the studies were linked to a few factors that suggested that basically these factors control the lion's share of research generation in the African continent. So these factors relate to peace, political institutions, international tourist arrivals, English as an official language, population size, and they focused on higher income and larger urban areas. So one can see that there is a skew in favor of certain areas that have certain characteristics, and that's where a lot of the data and research is being generated. And then those areas that don't have those characteristics may actually be marginalized in the generation of data and evidence. One doesn't have to look at Africa alone on this. You can look at other countries, even a country like the Philippines, where there's so much research in certain areas and very little research in areas that maybe have to do with multidisciplinary expertise or have touch on institutions, governance, those issues that may be trickier to study, maybe even somewhat dangerous to study to the extent that they touch on deep political economy and power structures in the country. So one can imagine that there may be an abundance of research in certain areas and lack of research in those areas, which are also quite important, if not more important, for democratic governance. Here, I like this study, and I'll talk a little bit about it. There is a study of randomized controlled trial experiments in India. I assume that you are all familiar with randomized controlled trial studies. These are rigorous impact evaluations based on that robust method. And this study found evidence that the RCTs are largely being produced in those areas with high political competition, politically competitive jurisdictions. Now, this is very important finding for developing democracies, I think, certainly a developing democracy like India, where if you don't see strong political competition in different jurisdictions, you may not necessarily see deep questions answered by these robust impact evaluations. And it appears that it's only in those politically competitive jurisdictions that there appears to be a willingness to generate, or maybe the conditions for generating those research questions and studies that attack maybe some of the deep challenges, deep governance and development challenges in those jurisdictions. So one can imagine that in a different setting where there is no or there is less political competition, such as those places dominated by only a few political parties, or only a few politicians, or only a few political families, that you may not necessarily see this kind of appetite for rigorous impact evaluations, probably because those impact evaluations also touch on the deep power structures, imbalances, and inequality that are associated with lack of political competition. So a lot of food for thought, I think, and I wanted to emphasize that particular study that came out of our review of literature. This is also possibly a challenge, a big challenge, developing the willingness to pay to generate these rigorous impact evaluations. And it appears that many of them, in fact, the lion's share of them, according to this data set developed by 3IE, lion's share of them are paid for by donors, basically development partners. And the willingness to pay by countries themselves, both industrial and developing countries perhaps, that is a challenge to develop this kind of willingness to pay, and certainly a challenge to overcome part of the political economy behind the absence of this type of rigorous impact evaluation. And on that point, I just wanted to emphasize that there are new challenges that maybe further make the generation of data and evidence-based policymaking in general much more challenging in today's world, and particularly as it relates to populism, which are typically associated with an anti-expertise, anti-evidence bias, and also the rise of dis and misinformation, which are in many ways anathema to evidence-based policymaking, because they confuse citizens in terms of what is the truth and what is really data and evidence-based. So just to emphasize here that we should really think about the ecosystem, the evidence ecosystem, when it comes to evidence-based policymaking. And this, we here now begin to talk about how to address the challenges that I just laid out earlier in the presentation. So here, data and evidence generation should typically lead to access by these citizens and democratic stakeholders, which then should lead to political action to support evidence-based policies, which then should lead to more cost-effective programs and enhanced public services, which in turn should lead to citizens' appreciation of evidence-based policy outcomes, which should in turn translate into political support for those leaders and that process that generates stronger data and evidence-based policy making. This is, of course, the ideal ecosystem, but as I had just outlined in my presentation, there are so many challenges that weaken this ecosystem. And here I'll just point out a few. Data and evidence generation is not enough. There's not enough willingness to pay. There is even a strategic commitment to ignorance by certain groups. This is an idea developed by Professor Lant Pritchett of Harvard Kennedy School. He argued that certain certain policy areas may not necessarily have enough data and evidence because the advocates in those areas do not want the data and evidence to reveal weaknesses. So there often, in fact, appears to be a skew in favor of evaluating policies and programs that one would expect are actually working very effectively. And in fact, the reverse, those that are not working very effectively are less studied. So data and evidence generation as a whole should be supported, and certainly in a balanced way, not only in those areas that tend to be that one expects strong outcomes, but also in those areas that one doesn't expect strong outcomes, in order to be able to improve on those policies and programs. And then you can also look at access by citizens and democratic stakeholders. That's not always what takes place. Transparency is not always very strong. And even with transparency, if there's a lot of technical jargon and citizens don't really understand it, then you don't necessarily have strong appreciation by citizens. You also, in many cases, don't always see strong political action because state actors or even different stakeholders may be repressing that capability to form a strong political action around that evidence base. And then more cost-effective programs and enhanced public services may not necessarily be appreciated by citizens when those types of outcomes are actually pushed for by reformists. So these are some of the challenges that we see in the policy making ecosystem on evidence-based policy making. And certainly it highlights many challenges that we need to overcome. I just want to give a sense of some practical ways to overcome these challenges by giving a few examples before I begin to wrap up. This is one example, evidence to sustain effective policy reforms. I think one key example that is well studied, not just in the Philippines, but internationally, is the Pamilyang Pantawid program, our conditional cash transfer program, anti-poverty program for the country. It was introduced in 2009 by then President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, and the foresight of the reformists then was to tack on rigorous impact evaluations on the rollout of this program to try and sort out the kinks in the program and to continue to improve on it. That tended to be very, very beneficial also for the sustainability of this very effective program, because it allowed for advocates and for reformists to respond to critique and to continue to improve on the program. So here, a very popular critique is that the program creates dependency and indolence, when in fact the evidence does not suggest this. There is also a vigorous debate on the use of resources around the program because it's a rather large program at this point. But fortunately, there's a lot of evidence and data that can now be brought to bear on those types of discussions. And you also have very human stories coming out of the program to accompany the generation of independent studies, independent research that builds further credibility on the data and evidence base around the program. So the human studies of those success stories around the program, as well as the rigorous impact evaluations generated by independent groups, are what appear to be very successful ingredients in strong evidence-based policymaking that make this program sustained and more sustainable through continuous improvements now across four presidents: President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, President Aquino, President Duterte, and now President Marcos. I would also like to emphasize the evidence to stop corruption and ineffective programs. That's another success story, at least in certain areas that we see in a country like the Philippines. So this is just one example. As you know, our Department of Budget and Management makes a lot of the budget information quite transparent and quite accessible to the public. But because of the technical nature of this data and just the immense nature of data released to the public, citizens may not necessarily appreciate this, nor have the skills to appreciate this. So young people have stepped in here. In this case, one young expert with two data analysts stepped in to analyze the budgets that our government deployed as part of our pandemic response, and they saw areas for improvement, areas that implied leakages, and certainly areas that necessarily required stronger oversight in order for the pandemic response to be much more effective. And I just wanted to give credit to these young people because I think this is essentially the kind of work that we need to do better as experts, as scientists, to translate all that data, evidence, and research into effective communications and engagements with media to reach more citizens so that they appreciate how relevant that data and evidence is to their daily lives. That data and evidence that was used in order to expose areas for improvement in our pandemic response eventually also led to stronger checks and balances on the resources being used for the pandemic. I want to emphasize here also this aspect of giving our citizens agency in democratic governance. And here, as we know, we have a technical definition of poverty, which is defined by economists and maybe even validated by policymakers and legislators based on science, based on evidence. But thanks to this group, Social Weather Stations, that has been tracking self-rated poverty, it is a concept that is meant to complement the official poverty figures. It shows that the self-rated poverty does not always shadow the official poverty figures, and that many Filipinos, when asked whether they would rate themselves as poor, are still answering that they are still poor and vulnerable. This is much food for thought for our policymakers, because even as we are targeting the reduction of poverty within this administration to about single digit by 2028, and we have seen a gradual reduction of the official poverty figure across time, the pandemic notwithstanding, we do still see a fairly large self-rated poverty figures coming out of social weather stations. And it gives us a sense that even as we are reducing technical poverty, we do need to listen to our people as experts and as scientists to try and figure out why they are answering in this way, why they are still reflecting that there is a good deal of poverty and vulnerability still in the population. In the recently released survey, it's about half of the population believe they are still poor or mahirap. So next, I just want to emphasize some ideas in terms of ways forward, some policy recommendations, initial policy recommendations, that is, in order to respond to what we've been talking about. The first recommendation is to invest in data transparency and evidence generation. And so we do not have enough data and evidence generation in many parts of the world, and certainly where they do exist, they do tend to be imbalanced and focused only on certain areas, on certain sectors. And so we need to respond to this challenge and to make that data and evidence as much as possible transparent and accessible. We need to popularize and improve the accessibility of research findings so that these are not just technical jargon that most of our citizens don't understand, that we're able to translate our data and evidence into a message that actually matters to the day-to-day lives of our citizens. And here we need to partner with the other democratic stakeholders like media, who are better able to amplify the reach of our efforts to talk to our citizens and convey the findings of our research to them. Then we also need to look at mobilizing citizens coalitions, youth groups, to champion data evidence and democratization advocacies, to try and tap their energies so that they are able to sort of mobilize in these different groups, and also to tap their creativity, which we will need because our country is still quite young. Our youth peak in the country is expected to be hit by around 2045, 2050. And so this is a very young country, and obviously, many of the policies we will be advocating in terms of reforms, policy reforms, are likely to impact on the youth and their future, well-being and their prospects for development. So it's important that we reach out to them and figure out ways to strengthen their collective action and their way in order to utilize the data and evidence in the messaging that needs to reach more of them. We also need to invest in education to counter misinformation and disinformation, and to improve the appreciation of data, evidence, and science. And this is part of a broader trend now across the world, as I understand from the experts, that debunking data and evidence is not necessarily that effective. If you're looking at a river where there's a lot of trash, basically the misinformation and disinformation flowing downstream from that river, debunking focuses on the trash and misinformation accumulating downstream in that river. The effort now is to move upstream, to look at ways that you can pre-bunk that disinformation and misinformation, and maybe even sensitize younger people so that future generations of citizens will not be so vulnerable to these types of misinformation and disinformation. And then finally, to strengthen multidisciplinarity in policy discussions, to study the economics of inequality, psychology on fake news and on communications, to study political science, political economy, and more effective citizens' mobilization and empowerment, and what I just discussed today, the political economy of data and evidence-based policy making, which necessarily touches on so many disciplines. As you looked at the ecosystem, you need to understand biases, you need to understand in that way the psychology literature, you need to understand the communications literature in terms of reaching out to young people, reaching out to citizens as they also struggle with misinformation and disinformation. Then you need to look at the political economy of investing in data and evidence-based policies, the generation of the data and research, looking at what Lan Pritchett called the strategic commitment to ignorance that may still be an obstacle to evidence generation in certain areas, because advocates will not necessarily want to expose weaknesses in their advocated policy reforms. But these are the types of obstacles and constraints that we do need to overcome to further strengthen the evidence-based policymaking across the world, and also in particular the Philippines. So I'll leave it here. I look forward to your questions and your reactions to this presentation. And I again would like to thank you for the kind invitation to contribute to today's discussions.